Okay, this is my lecture on imperialism in China. It's going to be a little bit longer than the other ones. There's a lot of information to go over. But let's get started. Okay, a couple of things you need to know about how China felt about the West. And when we're talking about the West, we're talking about European countries. China rejected any offer of trading with the West. They felt that they were self-sufficient um, in pretty much everything that they did, and there was no reason to trade with the West because they looked at the West as barbarians or backwards kind of people, and they looked at themselves as being the most advanced civilization and self-sufficient, so they didn't need anything from the West. And in agriculture, they had fast-growing rice. They had maize and sweet potatoes and peanuts that were brought over from um, the New World in the 17th and 18th century that was helping with their growing population. They had plenty of natural resources such as silk, tin, silver, and iron. And they manufactured silk and high quality cottons and porcelain for plates. And so, from the Chinese perspective, it was they didn't need anything from the West, but the West definitely wanted things from them. And so the West had a really hard time negotiating and breaking into China and trying to get the Chinese to understand that, if they traded with them, things would be a lot better, at least from the Europeans' perspective. But the Chinese really weren't buying into it because they said, we're self sufficient, we really don't need you. And they basically told the West to go away. And so the West had to find something that the Chinese would want. And of course, they did. Okay, and unfortunately for the Chinese, that was opium. And so, opium, of course, is a drug. It derives from a poppy plant, and it looks like this right here. Okay, and of course, what you can do with this poppy plant and the seeds, and you can extract the seeds, and you can make heroin out of it. Okay, which of course is a narcotic. And of course, the British did this, and they planted a whole bunch of poppy seeds in India, in places like India and Pakistan and all this area, and they shipped it to China. And by 1835, they had approximately 12 million Chinese addicted to this drug. And of course, the Chinese government was beside itself because it didn't know what to do about it. But saying that, okay, the Europeans finally found something that the Chinese wanted. All right. And so eventually what's going to happen is that there's going to be so much tea and silver going out of China that the Chinese people, Chinese government basically says, okay, there's no more imports of opium. If we catch you with it, we're going to destroy you, we're going to bankrupt you, we're going to kill you, and so on. But the British had a little bit of a foothold in China, and so this obviously angers the British because the British are, saying things like, there should be free trade, and we're just supplying something that the Chinese people want. And of course, there's the Emperor of China saying, no, you can't do this, and he writes a letter to Queen Victoria, kind of demanding that the British kind of stop this drug trade. And basically, the whole thing comes apart, and by 1839, a war breaks out between the British and the Chinese. Now, unfortunately for the Chinese, they really weren't in a position to stop the British. I mean, by this time, the British had definitely overtaken a lot of areas. The Chinese were weak internally. They had some domestic problems, and most of the fighting did occur on the open sea. And of course, the British had the largest navy in the world, and the British had steamboats, and the Chinese did not. And eventually, it didn't take very long, but in 1842, the Chinese government signed what's called the Treaty of Nanking. I know the J is kind of a K looking, it should be like a K, so it's Nanking or Nanjing, some people call it. And so what did this do? Well, the British got a whole bunch of different things, but one of the things that they did get is they got this small little area called Hong Kong. And Hong Kong during this time period was kind of a a backwater area. It wasn't much to look at or to see, but it was a foothold into this vast area of Chinese markets. And so they got that. Okay, and there's a bigger picture of it right there. It's right there and right there. Oops. So what did the other things that the British um, wanted was they wanted what's called extraterritoriality rights, which meant that British citizens were not subject to Chinese laws, but if accused of a crime in China, um, they would basically be sent to British courts. And this is extremely important that you understand what this really means, is that um, it would be very difficult for the Chinese people if the British committed, or any foreigner would commit a crime in China, to prosecute them in China. And so this kind of more or less gave foreigners free reign to do whatever they want and ignore Chinese law because they weren't subjugated to Chinese law. So this caused a problem. Also, the United States got into the action in 1844. They signed a treaty as well, giving extraterritorial rights to them as well. So everybody's kind of getting a little niche into China during this time period. Problems that China's having during this time period, I kind of already mentioned internal problems, but the population is growing. Food production did not keep up with this increase. There's discouragement increase of opium addiction. Again, more and more Chinese are getting addicted to opium. And the Chinese began to rebel against the Qing dynasty, okay, because they're looking at all these problems, they're seeing what the foreigners are doing to their country, they don't like it, and of course they're looking for their government to do something about it, and this dynasty is powerless really to do anything about it. So what happens? You have what's called the Tamping Rebellion, okay, by 1850, Hong, who's the leader of this rebellion, organized a massive peasant army and took control of large areas of the southeast China. And it lasted for 10 or 12 years, but by 1864, with the rebellion being crushed, about 30 million people died. So with so many people dying, again, this weakens China, and more foreigners are able to come in and kind of carve out the little area of China. Now, they're not carving it out per se by people. What I mean by carving it out, they're economically carving out China. They're kind of controlling these little zones, and that's where their influence is at for those foreigners. Okay. Chinese government has both, like I mentioned, internal and external problems. There's a debate emerged in the Qing court. Okay, some leaders want to reform and modernize according to Western ways, and others want to continue on with traditional Chinese ways, and they essentially kind of don't do either one very well, and this again weakens their position. Okay, and one of the persons that's resistant to change is this empress. Zaiji held power in China from 1862 to 1908. She was committed to Chinese traditional values, and of course, as I mentioned, the movement had mixed results. So, as I already mentioned, okay, you have these, it started with the British, but other countries move in on China economically, and they carve out what's called spheres of influence. It's right there, spheres of influence, in which they kind of set up investment zones in China, and they kind of control those areas. The United States wants in on the action, and the Europeans basically tell the United States, yeah, good luck, we're already here, don't even bother. It's kind of like the little tiny kid that's trying to push his way through the crowd to see something, and the United States kind of arrives late to the party per se. But they declare what's called an open door policy, demanding free trade for all nations in China. And the British and the other European powers kind of just basically say, well, okay, I guess. I mean, we're already well established over here. The United States is all the way across the Pacific Ocean. Might as well, give them a little piece of the action and keep them satisfied. And this works out to the United States tremendously. And of course, everybody's doing all this, and nobody's talking to the Chinese about it. The Chinese are kind of saying, "Hey, wait a minute. What about us? How come? It's our country. What? How come you're not talking to us?" And of course, all these Europeans are saying, "Well, why? You have so many external problems and internal problems. We're actually helping you out." And of course, the Chinese are looking at this, going, "But you're taking over our country." And here's a really good map that kind of shows where these spheres of influences are and who dominates them in those areas. As you guys can see, you have the Russians closest to the Russian border, which would make sense. You got the British along this big, huge, long river, and they've got port cities along the way. You've got the Germans over here, you've got the Japanese here, you've got the French over here, and you got all these little tiny dots that represent port cities. And so with that, you've got more and more goods traveling by the Europeans into these areas, flooding the markets, gaining they're selling their products, but obviously when they're selling their products, the money that they're making is coming out of China and of course going someplace else. Might sound a little familiar. Alright. You also have, during this time period, another rebellion. It's called the Boxer Rebellion. This was a group of people that resented the privileges of the foreigners that they had, and it was kind of a secret organization, and they called themselves the Society of Righteousness and Harmonious Fist. And they called themselves Boxers for short. And they were, again, a group of people that didn't like the foreigners in there. And finally they had enough, and they descended on Beijing, the capital, and they kind of surrounded the European sections of the city. And the Empress expressed support for these people somewhat publicly, definitely privately, but did not back them up militarily. So she was kind of hoping that the secret group would kind of come in and rescue China and save the day, and that way she could say, I always supported these people all the time. But at the same time, she was also scared, and she realized that if she supported these people directly and openly and they lost, then of course the European powers would basically come in and take over all of China. And the Boxers murdered Europeans, missionaries, diplomats. It didn't really matter who. They went after anybody that was a foreigner in their country. So that's pretty much all you have to know about imperialism in China. It's a little bit different than in other parts of the world that we've talked about. You have what's called the sphere of influence in China that really didn't materialize in any other place. You have 2 rebellions in China, and all of these rebellions cost China millions and millions and millions of lives and money that went primarily to European pockets. So that's pretty much it for China.